The still small voice, Elijah's encounter at Mount Horeb after calling down fire from heaven, the prophet fled to the mountain where God spoke not in thunder, but in crushing silence. Approximately 850 BCE, a man arrives at the mountain called Horeb after 40 days of walking through wilderness terrain that should have ended his life. He carries no provisions. His physical condition suggests complete exhaustion. 3 weeks earlier, this same man stood before the assembled nation of Israel and called fire down from the sky, consuming a water-soaked altar and humiliating 450 prophets of a rival deity. Now he hides in a cave, asking the divine presence he once commanded with such spectacular authority to let him perish. The man's name is Elijah. The mountain is Horeb, known also as Sinai, the location where centuries earlier Moses received the fundamental covenant that defined Israel's relationship with their God. Elijah's journey to this specific location represents more than geographical movement. Every element of his arrival deliberately echoes the foundational theophany of his religious tradition. Moses spent 40 days on the mountain. Israel wandered 40 years in the surrounding wilderness. Elijah walks 40 days to reach the same sacred geography. The parallel is intentional, documented in 1 Kings chapter 19 with the kind of numerical precision that signals theological significance rather than coincidental timing. The catalyst for Elijah's flight was political rather than spiritual. At Mount Carmel, before witnesses from across the northern kingdom, he challenged the prophets of Baal to a public test. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices. Whichever deity answered with fire would be acknowledged as genuine. The Baal prophets performed their rituals from morning until evening with no response. Elijah drenched his altar with water until it pooled in the surrounding trench, then offered a brief prayer. Fire descended, consuming not only the sacrifice but the wood, the stones, the soil, and the water in the trench. The assembled crowd fell on their faces. Elijah seized the 450 Baal prophets and ordered their execution at the Kishon Brook. Queen Jezebel, patron of the Baal cult, sent a message the following morning. By this time tomorrow, Elijah would meet the same end as her prophets. The man who had just called down fire from heaven fled in terror. He ran southward into Judah, left his servant at Beersheba, continued alone into the wilderness, collapsed under a broom tree, and asked to perish. The psychological reversal is documented without editorial comment in the biblical text. Spectacular divine vindication followed immediately by suicidal despair. Public triumph followed by private collapse, an entity described as an angel-provided intervention. Twice the being appeared while Elijah slept beneath the broom tree, providing bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. The text offers no description of the angel's appearance, no account of how the food appeared, no explanation of the water's source in desert terrain. Only the outcome receives documentation. Sustained by this provision, Elijah walked 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. The cave where Elijah sheltered at Horeb may have been the same cleft in the rock where Moses stood while the divine glory passed by, covering Moses with his hand so the prophet could see only the divine back, not the face that no human could witness and survive. The geography of divine encounter repeats. Elijah receives the same question Moses heard centuries earlier. What are you doing here? Elijah's response reveals the psychology driving his flight. He recounts his faithfulness to the covenant while the Israelites have abandoned it, torn down the altars, executed the prophets. He alone remains, and now they seek to end his life. The answer focuses entirely on Elijah's isolation, his perception of being the sole faithful remnant in a nation that has turned against both God and prophet. The divine response comes in stages, each stage documented with precise phenomenological detail. First, instructions: go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. The language explicitly recalls the Mosaic theophany when God passed by Moses in the cleft of the rock. The expectation is clear. Divine encounter at Sinai means overwhelming sensory manifestation. A great wind arrives first, so violent it tears the mountains apart and shatters rocks. The The text specifies the wind's destructive capacity in geological terms. This is not metaphorical language, but documented physical force capable of fragmenting stone. The wind passes. The text states clearly, "The Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. The mountain shakes with seismic force." Again, the documentation is specific. Not trembling, not minor ground movement, but earthquake of sufficient magnitude to be felt throughout the mountain. The earthquake passes. The text states, "The Lord was not in the earthquake." After the earthquake, fire, the same element that descended at Carmel, that consumed Moses' burning bush without destroying it, that led Israel through the wilderness as a pillar of flame. Fire passes over the mountain. The text states, "The Lord was not in the fire." After the fire, something the Hebrew text describes as kol demamadaka. Translation of these three words has occupied biblical scholars for centuries because the phrase appears nowhere else in Hebrew scripture. Kol means sound or voice. Demama suggests silence, stillness, or calm. Daka means thin, small, or crushed. The King James translation rendered it a still small voice, a phrase that entered English as an idiom for inner moral guidance. Modern translations offer a sound of sheer silence, a low whisper, a gentle whisper, a soft murmuring sound. The most literal rendering might be the sound of crushing silence or the voice of thin quiet. Frank Moorcross argued for the sound of a light wind, connecting it to atmospheric phenomena distinct from the violent wind that preceded it. Walter Brueggemann's analysis in his commentary on 1st and 2nd Kings identified the theological function of the phrase as establishing contrast, spectacular sensory manifestation versus communication that operates below normal human sensory thresholds. The divine presence manifests not in the overwhelming phenomena that characterized the Mosaic Sinai encounter, but in something that requires complete stillness to perceive. When Elijah hears the kol demamadaka, he wraps his face in his mantle and goes out to stand at the entrance of the cave. The face-covering gesture recalls Moses covering his face before the burning bush, unable to look at God. Elijah positions himself for divine encounter, responding to the crushing silence with the ritual gestures appropriate to theophany. The same question returns, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah gives the identical answer word for word. His zealousness for the Lord, Israel's covenant abandonment, the destroyed altars, the executed prophets, his solitary survival, the threat to his life. The repetition functions diagnostically. God clearly knows what Elijah is doing at Horeb. The question serves not to gather information, but to draw Elijah from self-absorption into self-examination, creating psychological space for what follows. The commission delivered in the crushing silence carries more political consequence than the fire at Carmel. Elijah receives instructions to anoint Hazael as king of Syria, Jehu as king of Israel, and Elisha as his prophetic successor. These three anointings will initiate a cascade of assassinations, coups, and dynastic overthrows that reshape the entire ancient Near East political landscape. Hazael will seize the Syrian throne through violence. Jehu will execute a bloody purge of the Israelite royal family, wiping out the house of Ahab and Jezebel. Elisha will succeed Elijah and witness the fulfillment of these prophecies. The fire at Carmel resulted in the deaths of 450 prophets. The quiet voice at Horeb set in motion political violence that toppled kingdoms. The theological point, documented in 1 Kings 19, centers on this contrast. Spectacular divine power versus authoritative divine word. The coercive sensory manifestation proves less consequential than the communication delivered in crushing silence. The divine response also corrects Elijah's self-perception. He believes himself the sole surviving faithful Israelite. God informs him that 7,000 in Israel have not bowed to Baal, have not kissed the idol. Elijah's crisis stemmed partly from accurate assessment of Israel's apostasy and partly from catastrophic underestimation of the faithful remnant. He was never as alone as he believed. The text documents one additional detail: Elijah's response to the commission. He leaves Horeb, finds Elisha plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, throws his mantle over him as a gesture of prophetic succession and permits Elisha to bid farewell to his parents before following. The suicidal despair documented under the broom tree has transformed into purposeful action. The encounter at Horeb accomplished what the spectacular vindication at Carmel could not. Reorientation of the prophets, understanding of both divine presence and prophetic mission. The still small voice passage has influenced Western religious language and practice across centuries. The phrase itself entered common English usage as an idiom for conscience or inner moral guidance distinct from external authority. Christian and Jewish contemplative traditions both drew on this text to argue for silence and interior stillness as superior to sensory religious experience for genuine divine communication. The theological claim that God was not in the wind, earthquake, or fire represented a significant qualification of the Sinai theophany tradition and shaped the development of mystical spirituality in both traditions. The deliberate revision of the Mosaic Sinai encounter, documented in 1 Kings 19, presents two models of divine presence: overwhelming sensory manifestation versus communication that requires complete receptive stillness to perceive. The text does not reject the validity of the former. Wind, earthquake, and fire genuinely occur, demonstrating divine power over nature. But it locates the actual divine communication in the crushing silence that follows, suggesting that spectacular religious experience and genuine divine encounter may be distinct phenomena. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.